Duilio Genovesi came home without warning. No one knew he was back. The black SUV rolled through the iron gates without a call ahead, without a text 2 days early. The deal in the city had collapsed, and when a deal collapsed in Duilio's world, men ended up in rivers. He was in no mood for conversation. He stepped through the front door and the mansion swallowed him whole. Silence. The same silence that had lived in these walls for 9 months. Heavy, familiar. He loosened his watch. His gold watch caught the light from the foyer chandelier. The neck tattoos above his open collar, the ones men on 3 continents had learned to fear, rose and fell with a slow, controlled breath. He was home. And then he heard it. A sound. Coming from somewhere deep inside the house. His body reacted before his mind did. His jaw locked. His hand moved, instinct, muscle memory, 10 years of staying alive, reaching for the weapon at his side. Someone is in my house. He moved toward it. Quiet. Precise. The way he moved through every dangerous situation he had ever walked into and walked out of breathing. The sound grew louder. It was coming from the kitchen. He didn't understand it. It wasn't the sound of danger. It wasn't glass breaking or men moving or the silence that follows a gunshot. It was something else entirely. Something he almost didn't recognize. He pushed the kitchen door open. And Duilio Genovesi, a man who had never flinched at anything, stopped dead, and holstered his weapon. Duilio Genovesi was the head of the Genovesi family, one of the most feared criminal organizations operating between New York and Naples. He controlled import routes, underground networks, and the kind of backroom arrangements that kept powerful men in powerful positions. His name was not spoken carelessly. His silence in a negotiation cost men more sleep than any threat. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a suit that cost more than most people's cars. He had a gold watch he never took off and a jaw that had never learned to soften. Everything he had ever wanted, he had taken. Everything he had ever built, he had protected. Except one thing. His wife, Cara Genovesi, was killed 9 months ago. Shot twice in the chest on a Tuesday afternoon in broad daylight, 2 blocks from the private preschool where she had just picked up their daughters. A rival family had wanted to send a message. They chose her to send it. She had thrown herself over the girls in the back seat. All 3 daughters survived. Not a scratch on them. Duilio had been in Milan when the call came. He landed in New York 11 hours later and identified her body with the same expression he wore to business meetings, because if he let the expression change, he would not survive what was underneath it. At the funeral, something happened to his daughters. Nicole, Nelia, and Nancy, 4 years old, copper-haired, identical down to the pink bows their mother had tied in their curls that last morning, stopped speaking. All 3 of them. At the same time. As if grief had reached into their chests and taken their voices as payment. Nicole used to narrate everything. She provided commentary on breakfast, on the clouds, on the behavior of ants. Nelia had a habit of collecting words she liked and repeating them slowly, tasting each one. Nancy sang. Constantly, tunelessly, joyfully, in the bath, at the table, walking down hallways, sometimes in her sleep. After the funeral, nothing. 9 months of nothing. 3 little girls sitting in sunlight with their hands in their laps, staring at the middle distance like beautiful, hollow things. You could walk into a room and not know they were there until you saw the stillness of them, 3 pairs of green eyes watching the world from somewhere very far away. Duilio did what men with his kind of money do when something is broken. He spent his way toward a solution. Child psychiatrists from Johns Hopkins. Trauma specialists flown in from London. Equine therapy, art therapy, sensory therapy. A private trip to Florida. A week in the Swiss Alps. Puppies. A garden playhouse the size of a small apartment. The girls accepted everything with the same polite emptiness. He did the other thing too. He found the men responsible for Kara's death and he removed them from the world with the efficiency of a man settling accounts. It took him 4 months. It changed nothing. So Duilio buried himself in work the way drowning men grab for anything solid. 18-hour days. Back-to-back trips. Chicago, Dubai, Palermo. Because sitting in the upstate New York mansion, with its white walls and family portraits and 3 small girls who looked through him like glass, felt like being held underwater. The estate had 22 rooms, a private pool, and grounds that a groundskeeping staff of 4 maintained year-round. It was the loneliest place he had ever been. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling at something in you, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know who's here for this. This is a story about what happens when the most powerful man in the room realizes that power was never the point. For 9 months, Duilio's household had been run with quiet efficiency by Margot, his senior house manager, a woman who had been with the Genovesi family since before the girls were born, who had dressed Nicole's scraped knee and watched Nancy take her first steps and stood at Kara's graveside with her hands folded and her face composed, because someone had to be. One evening, Margot appeared in the doorway of Duilio's study. He did not look up. What? Margot had spent enough years in this house to know the difference between the silence that meant not now and the silence that meant I'm listening. She had learned to speak into the second kind regardless. The girls need more than I can give them, she said. They need someone with them. Consistently. Someone who can just be with them. All day. I've found someone I think you should consider. Duilio turned a page. Hire her. You haven't heard the terms. Hire her, Margot. Margot nodded once and left the doorway. 3 days later, Julie Brandt arrived at the iron gates with one bag, steady hands, and no particular expression on her face, and the thing that was going to undo Duilio Genovesi walked quietly into his house. The Genovesi estate sat at the end of a private road behind iron gates that opened for no one without permission. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was, the home of a man who had one. White stone facade. Black window frames. 3 floors of architectural certainty rising from manicured grounds that stayed green regardless of season because someone was paid to keep them that way. Inside, it was a different kind of place entirely. The rooms were large and immaculate and completely, utterly still. Sound didn't carry the way it should in a house with children. Footsteps were muffled. Doors closed softly. Even the clock seemed to tick at a lower register, as if the house itself had learned to hold its breath. Nicole, Nelia, and Nancy lived on the 2nd floor, in 3 rooms connected by a shared sitting area that Kara had decorated herself, yellow curtains, a low bookshelf painted white, a soft rug in the middle of the floor where the afternoon light pooled like honey. It was still beautiful. It was still exactly as she had left it. And the girls sat in it each morning with their copper curls brushed and their pink bows tied and their hands folded in their laps, looking at something no one else in the room could see. They were 4 years old. They were the same height, the same face, the same green eyes their mother had given them. If you didn't know them, you might think they were simply quiet children. Calm. Well-behaved. If you knew them, you understood that the stillness was not peace. It was absence. As if the part of each girl that made noise and took up space and demanded things had simply stepped out. 9 months ago. And hadn't come back. The specialists called it acute trauma response. Selective mutism compounded by shared grief. They used careful language and left careful notes and billed careful invoices, and none of it moved the girls 1 inch toward the children they had been before. Before was Tuesday. Before was a phone call Duilio took in Milan while standing at a window overlooking the Duomo, a glass of water in his hand that he did not remember dropping. Before was a casket and a graveside and 3 4-year-olds in black coats holding hands so tightly that separating them at bedtime required patience neither Duilio nor anyone on his staff reliably possessed. Now he paced his study on the ground floor surrounded by evidence of a life he had not been able to protect. Kara smiled at him from every wall, their wedding, the girl's christening, a candid photograph from a beach holiday he barely remembered taking. He never took them down. He never looked at them directly either. He had built an empire. He had ended the men responsible. He had spent without limit and traveled without stopping and worked without sleeping. The girls still sat upstairs in the yellow light, holding hands, saying nothing. And the house breathed around them, slowly, shallowly, waiting for something none of them knew how to name. Julie Brandt arrived on a Wednesday morning in early October, which meant the trees lining the private road to the Genovesi estate were the color of a slow fire. She noticed them through the window of the car that had been sent to collect her, a black town car, driven by a man who had not offered his name and had not asked for hers. She had decided immediately that she liked him for it. She had one bag. Everything she owned that mattered fit inside it, which said something about either her circumstances or her priorities, and she had long since stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. The gate was taller than she had expected. Iron, black, set into a stone wall that extended in both directions as far as she could see. It opened without ceremony when the car approached, which somehow made it more intimidating rather than less, the easy authority of a thing that had never needed to announce itself. The house, when it appeared at the end of the drive, was exactly what the gate had promised. White. Enormous. Precise. The kind of building that had been designed to communicate something specific about its owner, and succeeded completely. Julie looked at it without expression and thought, this is where the girls live. This is where they wake up every morning and go to sleep every night. She filed that thought somewhere useful and stepped out of the car. Margot met her at the door. She was a woman in her early 40s with the posture of someone who had spent decades holding things together through sheer discipline of spine. She shook Julie's hand once, firmly, and led her inside without preamble, which Julie appreciated. The foyer was marble and chandelier and portrait. She did not look at the portraits yet. The rules were delivered in the kitchen over coffee that Julie did not ask for but drank anyway, because refusing felt like exactly the wrong first move in this house. Margot spoke with the measured efficiency of someone who had given this speech before, or at least rehearsed it enough times that it had shed any softness it might once have had. Do not engage Mr. Genovesi directly unless he speaks to you first. Do not ask questions about the family's history or circumstances. Keep the children calm, keep the children safe, keep the children on schedule. Their schedule was printed on a laminated card on the refrigerator. She was to follow it. She was not to deviate without permission. She was not to take the children off the grounds without advance notice and an escort. The children's rooms were on the second floor. She would have a room adjacent to them. She was to consider herself available at all hours. Julie listened to all of it. She nodded at the appropriate intervals. She did not write anything down. And the girls themselves, she asked, when Margot had finished. What do I need to know about them specifically? Margot was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in the careful architecture of her face, small, controlled, but present. They don't speak, she said. They haven't, for 9 months. The doctors have explained what they can. Beyond that, she paused. Beyond that, they are 4 years old, and they have lost their mother, and they are doing the best they can. It was the most human thing Julie would hear in that house for a long time. She stored it carefully. She met the girls that afternoon, in the upstairs sitting room with the yellow curtains. Margot opened the door and stepped aside, and Julie walked in alone, which she suspected was a test of some kind and did not mind. 3 pairs of green eyes turned toward her from across the room. They were on the floor near the low bookshelf, Nicole closest to the window, Nelia beside her with a picture book open in her lap, Nancy a half step behind both of them as if she had been caught mid-approach to something and frozen in place. Their copper curls were brushed. Their pink bows were perfectly tied. They looked like something out of a painting, if the painter had been interested in depicting a very specific and very quiet kind of grief. Julie looked at them. They looked at her. She crossed the room, sat down on the rug in front of them without asking anyone's permission, and folded her legs beneath her. She did not say hello. She did not introduce herself. She did not produce a toy or a game or a therapeutic technique. She simply sat, at their level, in their space, and waited. Nancy's eyes narrowed slightly. Nelia looked down at her picture book, then back up. Nicole held perfectly still and watched Julie with an expression of thorough and unsentimental assessment that belonged on someone 4 times her age. Julie reached into her bag and took out a small, battered paperback, her own, dog-eared and soft from years of handling, and opened it in her lap. She began to read. To herself, quietly, lips barely moving. She stayed like that for 45 minutes. The girls did not approach her. They did not move away. When Margot appeared in the doorway to say that dinner was ready, Julie closed her book, stood up, and said, to no one in particular, to all 3 of them equally, "See you tomorrow." She was almost to the door when she heard it. The softest sound. Barely a sound at all. She did not turn around. She did not react. But she heard it, the small, involuntary exhale of a child releasing tension they hadn't known they were holding. It was the smallest possible beginning. Julie took it with her down the hallway like something cupped in both hands. It started with a Tuesday and a decision Julie made without consulting anyone. She had been in the house for 10 days. 10 days of sitting on rugs and reading books and eating her meals in careful proximity and doing nothing that could be called progress by any clinical measure, but doing nothing that could be called failure either. The girls had stopped flinching when she entered a room. Nancy had, twice, moved to sit slightly closer during the reading hour. These were not things that appeared on therapy charts. They were things Julie counted anyway. On the 11th day she walked into the kitchen at 7 in the morning, found Margot already at the counter with coffee, and said, "I'd like to bake with them today." Margot looked at her over the rim of her cup. "The children don't cook. They will today." There was a pause that contained several things, Margot's professional skepticism, her underlying exhaustion, and something Julie was beginning to recognize as the older woman's very private and very guarded hope. "I'll have someone clean up after," Margot said finally, and that was that. Julie collected the girls from the sitting room after breakfast. She didn't explain what they were doing. She simply appeared in the doorway, said, "Kitchen," and walked back down the hall. There was a long pause, she counted to 7 before she heard footsteps, and then, in the particular order they had already established for themselves without anyone telling them to, Nicole first and Nancy last, they followed her. She had already assembled everything on the counter. Flour, butter, sugar, eggs. A large mixing bowl. An apron for herself that she put on with a certain ceremony, as if it were armor. 3 smaller aprons that she set on the counter without comment, without handing them out, without making anything of them at all. She began to measure. She narrated as she went, not to the girls specifically, not with the performative brightness of someone working from a therapeutic script, but in the low, conversational murmur of someone who happened to be talking while she worked and happened to have an audience. 300 grams of flour. Butter at room temperature, always, because cold butter is a fight and she had enough of those. 2 eggs. She cracked the first one on the edge of the bowl and a piece of shell fell in and she fished it out with 2 fingers and said, under her breath, every time. Nancy laughed. It was not a laugh, technically. It was the compressed, involuntary huff of a child who has been surprised into amusement against her own resistance. It lasted approximately 1 second. But it was the first sound any of them had made in Julie's presence, and it hit the kitchen like a stone hitting water, the ripples going outward. Julie did not look up. She cracked the second egg. By the time she got to the mixing, Nicole had drifted to the counter and was watching with the focused attention she gave to everything. Nelia had climbed onto one of the stools and sat with her elbows on the marble, chin in her hands, eyes tracking every movement. Nancy stood at Julie's elbow at a distance of approximately 8 inches, close enough to see everything, far enough to retreat without commitment. Julie slid the mixing bowl slightly toward them without comment. She picked up her spoon and held it at a neutral angle, not offering it, not withholding it. She kept stirring. It was Nelia who reached for the bowl first. Quiet, careful, quick, as if she thought someone might stop her. Her small hand closed around the edge of the bowl and she pulled it a fraction of an inch closer to herself and looked up at Julie, waiting. Julie moved to the side to make room. She handed over the spoon. By 10:30 there was flour on the ceiling. There was butter on Nancy's bow, which had migrated somehow from pink to beige. There was a handprint on the window that Julie did not remember seeing happen and could not account for. The dough itself was lopsided and overworked and slightly the wrong color and was going to bake into something roughly the consistency of a determined brick, and it was the most successful morning the Genovesi kitchen had seen in 9 months. Nicole sat on the counter, she had climbed up without asking, and Julie had made no objection, and watched her sisters with an expression that was not quite smiling and not quite not smiling, occupying some careful territory in between. When Julie looked at her, she looked away. When Julie looked away, she looked back. The biscuits came out of the oven dense and uneven and they ate them anyway, the 4 of them, at the kitchen island, and nobody said anything, and it was the best meal Julie had eaten since she arrived. She looked up at the family portraits lining the wall above the window and thought, I see you. I'm trying. Give me time. It was Nicole who broke first, which surprised Julie, because Nicole was the one she had been watching most carefully and worrying about most quietly. Of the 3, she was the most contained. Nelia had warmth that leaked through the edges of her silence. She would occasionally press against Julie's arm during reading, briefly and without looking up, the way a cat leans and pretends it isn't leaning. Nancy had her involuntary reactions, her flickers of amusement and curiosity that escaped before she could catch them. But Nicole was still. Observant. Managed. A small person who had decided, at 4 years old, that the correct response to an uncontrollable world was to become as controlled as possible, and had committed to this with a thoroughness that would have been impressive in an adult. The humming started on a Thursday afternoon, 3.5 weeks into Julie's time at the estate. She was cleaning up after the afternoon baking session, which had become, through no formal declaration on anyone's part, the fixed center of each day, wiping down the marble counter while the girls had gone upstairs to wash up before dinner. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was humming a song she had carried around since childhood, low and automatic, the kind of thing that surfaces when the conscious mind is occupied elsewhere. She didn't know, until she heard it echoed, that anyone was still in the room. She stopped. The echo stopped. She stayed very still for a moment, her cloth on the counter, her breath even. Then she hummed the next note, just the next one, a single step up the scale, and waited. From behind her, from the doorway, came the same note back. Exact. Clear. Cautious. Julie did not turn around. She did not make any sound of recognition or surprise. She hummed the next 2 notes, lower this time, and stood with her back to the door and her hands on the counter and her heart doing something she did not entirely have language for. Nicole sang them back. They went on like that for 11 minutes. Julie would establish a phrase and Nicole would return it. The song grew, for notes, 6, a small refrain that developed its own logic in the call and response. At some point it stopped being a repetition and became a conversation, Nicole adding her own small variations, testing the edges, reaching into the melody and pulling something new from it. When Julie finally did turn around, Nicole was in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her bow slightly crooked from the day's activities, watching Julie with those assessing green eyes. She did not run. She did not smile. She held the eye contact for a long, level moment, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Then she turned and went upstairs. Julie sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs had made the decision before her mind caught up with it. She did not write it in the household notes. She did not call any of the specialists. This was not because she thought they wouldn't understand, it was because she knew, with a certainty she couldn't justify clinically, that naming it too loudly would damage it. Some things only survive in quiet. This was one of them. Within 4 days, the music had spread. Nancy began making small sounds while she worked the dough, not singing, exactly, but vocalizing, her own internal soundtrack leaking out through the labor of the task. She would stop immediately if she noticed anyone noticing. Julie learned not to notice. Nelia developed the habit of whispering to herself near the kitchen window, looking out at the grounds where the trees were turning. Julie, washing up nearby, caught fragments, the names of birds she could see on the branches, identified with the precision of a child who had been paying very close attention for a long time and simply, until now, had no reason to report her findings. Sparrow. Crow. That one there, the fat gray one, Nelia pressed her finger to the glass, pigeon. Julie heard it and did not react and went on washing the bowl and thought, there you are. There you all are. The house, which had spent 9 months learning to be quiet, was starting to forget how. The question came from Nelia on a Sunday afternoon, which is the time when grief tends to surface, the slow hours, the unstructured ones, the hours that have not been filled with purpose. They were in the sitting room, the 4 of them. Rain against the windows. The fat gray pigeon sheltering on the sill outside, which Nancy had taken to monitoring with a proprietorial concern that Julie found quietly wonderful. Julie was reading. The girls were arranged around her in the loose, unofficial formation they had settled into over weeks, close but not quite touching, present but with an exit available, the geometry of trust that is still learning its own dimensions. Nelia had a picture book in her lap but she wasn't reading it. She had been looking at the same page for 7 minutes, which Julie had noticed without indicating that she'd noticed, because this was the particular skill she had spent the last 5 weeks developing to a high degree of precision. Then Nelia looked up, and asked, "Where did Mama go?" The rain went on. The pigeon shifted on the sill. Nicole, without moving, became more still. Nancy's hand on her book went flat and slow. Julie set her own book down. She did not immediately answer, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she understood that this question deserved the full weight of a moment before it received a response. She died, Julie said. Simple. True. No softening that would require explaining later. That means her body stopped working, and she had to leave. Not because she wanted to. Because she didn't have a choice. Nelia processed this with the seriousness it deserved. Did it hurt her? I think it happened very fast, Julie said. I think she spent her last moments making sure the 3 of you were safe. I think that's the thing she cared about most. Nicole, by the window, had turned her face slightly away. Her jaw was doing the thing Julie had learned to read, the careful tensing of a child who is deciding whether to let something through or hold it back. Our nanny before said she's in heaven, Nancy said, from her position beside the pigeon window. Her voice was low and exploratory, testing the feel of words after long disuse. But Margot said she's in our hearts. Those are different things. They don't have to be, Julie said. Where is your mama? Nelia asked. And there it was. The question behind the question. The real thing, not information about death in the abstract, but a bid for the leveling that only shared experience can provide. Tell me you have lost something too. Tell me I am not alone in this shape of absence. Julie was quiet for a moment. She had not talked about this in this house. She had not been asked, and she had not offered, because she understood the rule, about staying in her lane, about the professional distance that kept things clean and workable. But there were moments when the professional distance was exactly the wrong tool for the job, and you had to know which kind of moment you were in. She died too, Julie said. A few years ago. I still miss her every day. Does it stop? Nicole asked, and it was the first time Nicole had spoken directly to her, first real words, and the sound of her voice was so like and so unlike the singing that Julie had to take a breath before she could answer. It doesn't stop, she said. But it changes. It gets less like a hole and more like a room you carry around with you, with all their things still in it. And sometimes you go in and it hurts. And sometimes you go in and it just feels like being close to them. The rain came down. The pigeon shuffled. It was Nelia who cried first, a sudden, complete, unguarded sob, the kind that happens when a body has been waiting a very long time to release something and finally receives permission. Then Nancy, whose face simply crumpled with a speed that broke something in Julie's chest. Then Nicole, last and with the greatest effort, as if she were dismantling something load-bearing inside herself brick by careful brick, and once she started she could not stop. Julie opened her arms and all three of them came in at once, the way they did everything, together, in their own order, on their own terms. She held them and they cried in the way that children cry when they have been waiting 9 months to do it, which is to say, completely, and without performance, and for a very long time. Her apron was ruined. Her yellow headband was pushed sideways. She didn't move for any of it. When they finally settled, exhausted, emptied, heavy in the particular peaceful way that comes after the kind of crying that has been a long time coming, Nancy looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes and said, in a voice rough from disuse and weeping, "Can we bake something?" "Yes," Julie said. "Absolutely yes." It had been building for days, the way weather builds, gradual shifts in pressure that you feel before you can name, a quality of air that is not quite the same as it was last week, last month, 9 months ago when the doors closed and the silence moved in and no one could find a way to move it out. By the middle of November, the Genovesi kitchen had become something that the rest of the house barely recognized. There was noise in it. Not the noise of a household running, pots and cleaning and the professional quiet efficiency of a well-staffed estate, but the specific, ridiculous, irreplaceable noise of small children who have decided that the world contains things worth being loud about. Nancy had discovered that if you dropped a handful of flour from high enough, it dispersed into a cloud, and she had spent the better part of 2 mornings testing the variables of this phenomenon with the dedication of a researcher whose career depended on the results. The ceiling above the island had acquired a faint but definitive white cast that no one had cleaned because, and Margot, passing the doorway, had identified this in herself with some surprise, she didn't want to. Nelia had begun talking continuously during baking sessions. Not to Julie specifically, not to her sister specifically, but to the general atmosphere of the kitchen, in a low-running commentary that covered the birds outside, the behavior of butter when it met heat, the particular properties of the color pink, and the many profound injustices of being the middle triplet, a role she described with the weary authority of a long-serving diplomat. Nicole sang. She had started with the call and response in the kitchen doorway and she had not stopped since. She sang while she measured. She sang while she waited. She had begun to assign different songs to different tasks, so that the Wednesday afternoon pastry session had its own particular melody, distinct from Tuesday's bread, which was a slower and more serious affair. She did not explain this system. She simply implemented it and expected the world to adapt, which, in Julie's experience, was exactly the personality she had always been. And this was the morning Margot stood in the kitchen doorway for 11 minutes without anyone noticing she was there. She had come down to discuss the week's schedule. She had stopped at the door because she did not entirely trust what she was seeing and needed to look at it for a while before she accepted it as real. Nancy was on Julie's shoulders. This had happened in a single, decided motion. Nancy had simply walked up behind Julie, tapped her on the hip, and raised both arms in the universal 4-year-old gesture that means, up. Now. Julie had bent her knees and Nancy had climbed, her pink bow migrating toward her left ear, one small hand gripping the yellow headband for stability and the other arm extended, pointing at her sisters on the counter with the air of someone who has just won something significant. Nicole and Nelia were on the counter, which they were not supposed to be on, both of them shrieking with a delight so complete and physical that their feet kicked against the cabinet doors in irregular percussion. Nelia had flour on both cheeks. Nicole was laughing with her whole face, actually laughing, the full architecture of her expression rearranged into something open and unguarded and nothing at all like the controlled assessment she had worn for 9 months. Julie was spinning. Her apron was destroyed, flour, butter, something that might have been jam, and her yellow headband was somewhere around her ear, and she was laughing as hard as any of them, which Margot had not previously thought her capable of, having only encountered the woman's professional composure. Margot stood in the doorway for 11 minutes and felt something shift in her chest that she would not have been able to name with any precision, but which she recognized from the day these girls were born, when she had stood in a different doorway of this same house and understood that she loved this family with a thoroughness she hadn't budgeted for. She took her phone from her pocket. She found the number she rarely used, the one that rang through to Duilio directly when every other channel had been deliberately routed away from him. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was at his desk and the Milan meeting was already done. "What's happened?" he said, flat, immediate, already calculating. "You need to come home," Margot said. She paused, because she was not sure how to prepare him for what he was going to see and was not sure it was possible to prepare someone for it anyway. "Something's happened with the girls." A silence. She could feel him constructing threat assessments. "Are they?" "They're fine," she said. "Come home, Duilio." She hung up and looked at the kitchen one more time, Nancy on Julie's shoulders pointing at the world like she owned it, Nicole laughing, Nelia's flour-dusted cheeks, and she thought, whatever happens next, this happened. This was real. No one can take this back. She put her phone away and went to ask someone to prepare the guest rooms. He saw all of it. He had come in the way he always came home, through the side entrance off the garage, quiet and unannounced, the route that kept him out of the foyer and its portraits. He had loosened his tie in the car. He still had his hand near his jacket when he pushed open the kitchen door. He saw Nancy on the maid's shoulders. He saw Nicole and Nelia on the counter he had explicitly and repeatedly said the children were not to climb on. He saw flour on his ceiling and what appeared to be something sticky on his cabinet doors and the complete, catastrophic disorder of a kitchen that had been treated as a playground by people who did not understand what this kitchen was, what this house was, who had paid for every surface in it and why. He saw his daughters laughing. He stood in the doorway and he felt, in rapid succession, the following things, relief so sharp it was almost pain, because they were alive and present and making noise and were not the hollow-eyed girls he'd left behind. Then, directly behind the relief, like a wave behind a wave, something much uglier, a compound of shame and fury and grief and ego that he would not, for a long time, be able to disentangle into its component parts. His daughters were laughing. A stranger had made them laugh. He had spent 9 months and a significant portion of his criminal fortune, and they had stayed locked inside themselves, and this woman with flour on her apron and a yellow headband and his youngest child on her shoulders, had done in 6 weeks what he had failed to do in 9 months. He did not move. He stood in the doorway and he looked at the scene, and the scene looked back at him, and then Nancy noticed him first, because Nancy always noticed everything first, and she went quiet on the maid's shoulders and pointed at him with the same finger she'd been using to point at her sisters. The kitchen caught up. One by one. The noise drained. Julie turned, Nancy still on her shoulders, and looked at him with an expression that was careful and still and not afraid, which for some reason made it worse. "Mr. Genovesi," she said. "I didn't know you were coming home today." "Evidently," he said. He looked at his daughters. They looked at him. Nicole had straightened on the counter and recollected her composure with a speed that told him she had been practicing it since before she could walk. Nelia's hand was pressed to her floury cheek. Nancy had both arms wrapped around the maid's head from above. "Get down from there," he said, to Nicole and Nelia, not unkindly. To Nancy, "Come here." They obeyed. Of course they obeyed, they always obeyed him, had always obeyed him, had been perfectly behaved and perfectly silent and perfectly unreachable for 9 months. Nancy slid from Julie's shoulders and crossed the kitchen to him and stood at his knee and looked up at him with her green eyes, and he put his hand briefly on the top of her head and felt his chest do something that he had no mechanism for processing. "Go upstairs," he said. "All 3 of you. I'll come up before dinner." They went. He tracked the sound of their feet on the stairs until the house absorbed it. Then he looked at Julie Brandt. She was watching him with the same expression she'd had since he walked in, level, contained, not combative, not apologetic. Waiting. He did not say anything then. He went to his study and spent 4 hours in it, and signed things and took calls and performed the machinery of his empire with the practiced automation of a man who knows how to function while something else is happening underneath. At 10 o'clock, when the girls were long since in bed and the house was quiet again, he came to the kitchen where Julie was finishing the last of the cleaning. He stood in the doorway. "I'm terminating your employment," he said. "You'll be paid through the end of the month. Margot will arrange a car in the morning." Julie set down the cloth she was holding. She looked at him for a long moment, a full, clear, unhurried look, the kind that takes a person's exact measure, and then she nodded once, picked up the cloth again, folded it, and set it on the counter with a precision that said everything and nothing. "Good night, Mr. Genovesi," she said. He walked back down the hallway. He did not look at the staircase as he passed it. He did not let himself see what he already knew was there, 3 bedroom doors standing open a careful inch, 3 pairs of green eyes in the dark, watching. He went to his study and poured 2 fingers of whiskey and stood at the window and looked at the grounds, and the grounds gave nothing back. It took 3 days. 3 days for the kitchen to go quiet again, not the clean quiet of a well-run house, but the specific, textured, unbearable silence that Duilio had spent 9 months learning to navigate and had, in the space of 6 weeks, almost forgotten how to live inside. Nicole stopped humming on the first day. It happened gradually, the way a fire goes out, not all at once but a diminishing, a cooling, the light going from warm to neutral to nothing. By the second morning, she was back at the window in the sitting room, watching the grounds with the still, managed focus of someone who has decided that watching is safer than wanting. Nelia stopped naming the birds on the second day. She was at the kitchen window during breakfast. Julie's baking sessions had not been formally replaced with anything, which meant the mornings were a kind of open wound, an unfilled space that had previously been flour and noise and a woman with a yellow headband, and was now just time. The fat gray pigeon was on the sill. Nelia looked at it. She pressed her finger to the glass in the way she always had. But she said nothing. Nancy stopped eating properly on the 3rd day. She sat at her place at the table and moved things around her plate with the systematic indifference of a child who has concluded that meals are no longer of interest. She didn't cause trouble. She didn't refuse. She simply left most of it and looked, when Margot checked on her, like a girl who was doing her best to be somewhere else. Margot came to Duilio's study on the evening of the third day. She did not knock, she had not knocked in 15 years and she was not about to start, and she stood in the middle of the room and said, "You need to understand what you've done." Duilio looked up from his desk. "They've gone dark again," Margot said. "All three of them. In 3 days." She let that sit for a moment. "It took 9 months to get there the first time. It took 6 weeks to come back. It took you 3 days to put them back where they were." He did not answer. Margot, who had worked for him long enough to know when silence was processing and when it was deflection, recognized this as the former, and waited. "She was good for them," he finally said. "Yes," Margot said. "She was. She overstepped." Margot looked at him with an expression she reserved for moments when she had already decided that honesty was more important than comfort. "She did her job," she said. "She did it better than anyone you have paid in the last 9 months. What she overstepped was your ability to tolerate being shown how." She left before he could respond, which was also something she had perfected over 15 years. He sat with it for a long time. He sat with the whiskey he didn't drink and the calls he didn't take and the reports on his desk that said nothing about any of the things that were actually at stake in his life, and he thought about a kitchen with flour on the ceiling and a child on someone's shoulders pointing at the world. He found Julie's address in the household file. He drove himself, which he almost never did anymore, in an ordinary black car without anyone in the passenger seat, and he parked outside a building in a neighborhood that was several significant steps below anything he was used to, and he sat in the car for 6 minutes, which was 5 minutes and 55 seconds longer than Duilio Genovesi usually spent preparing for anything. She answered the door in a gray sweater with a book in her hand, the same small battered paperback he had seen her reading to herself on the floor of his daughter's sitting room on her first day. She looked at him. She did not appear surprised. She did not step back to let him in and she did not move to close the door. She simply held it open and waited. "They've gone silent again," he said. "All three. In 3 days." "I know," she said. "Margot texted me." He had not expected that. He recalibrated. "I need you to come back." "I'm sure you do," she said. A pause. He was not accustomed to pauses in which he was not the one in control of the outcome. "Tell me what I have to do," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, stripped of the usual architecture, the authority, the carefully maintained implication that every question he asked was already close to being answered, that was not Duilio Genovesi the boss. Was, perhaps, something older. Something that had been under all of it for a very long time. Julie looked at him for a long moment with the clear, direct assessment she had been giving him since the day she walked through his gates. "Everything," she said. "You come back to your daughters. Not as someone fixing a problem. As their father. You show up, in the kitchen, at the window, in the sitting room on the rug. You learn Nicole's songs. You ask Nelia about the birds. You let Nancy climb you like a tree, because that's what she needs and you keep bracing yourself every time she reaches for you and she feels it. She's 4 and she feels it." She paused. "You change your schedule. You change your life. Not the empire, I'm not asking you to be a different man. I'm asking you to be a present one. For them. Consistently. Without conditions." The street was quiet. Somewhere a car passed. The yellow light from the building behind her fell across the threshold between them. "And if I do those things," he said, "you'll come back. If you do those things," she said, "they won't need me the way they do now." But yes. I'll come back. He nodded once and turned to go. Mr. Genovesi, she said. He stopped. They didn't go silent because their mother died, she said. They went silent because they were alone in it. Don't let them be alone in it anymore. He walked back to the car. He sat in it for another minute, looking at the steering wheel, and then he drove home through streets that looked different than they had on the way out, which he understood had nothing to do with the streets. He started the next morning. Not with a speech, not with a prepared approach, not with anything that could be recognized as a strategy, because he understood, in a way he was still working out the implications of, that the strategies were the problem. He had been solving for his daughters the way he solved for everything, and it had produced exactly nothing. He came to the kitchen at 7. He was in a white shirt, no jacket, which in itself was unusual enough that Margot, pouring coffee, took a half-second longer than necessary to hand him a cup. He took it and stood at the counter and waited. The girls came down at 7:15 in their established order, Nicole first, Nelia, Nancy last. They stopped when they saw him. The particular stillness of children recalibrating their understanding of a space they thought they knew. He said, I thought I might bake something. I don't know how. You'd have to show me. Nothing. 3 green-eyed assessments, conducted simultaneously, very thorough. Nancy walked to the counter, climbed up onto a stool, and pointed at the flour canister. She didn't speak. She didn't look at him. But she pointed. He got the flour. It was not a miracle. Miracles are clean and sudden and don't require anyone to measure the wrong amount of butter 4 times while 2 children watch in patient, slightly incredulous silence. What it was a beginning, awkward and imperfect and real in the particular way that only imperfect things are, because perfection has no texture and you can't hold on to it. Julie came back on a Thursday, a week and a half later. Not as an employee. The conversation about what exactly she was had been brief and practical and had resulted in a title that satisfied no existing category, which was fine, because the thing itself satisfied something more important. She had a room. She had a schedule she had negotiated herself. She had Duilio's number and explicit standing permission to use it when she thought he was failing, which she had already told him she would exercise without sentiment. The girls met her at the door. Nancy had clearly been watching from the upstairs window because she was already running, down the stairs, through the foyer, out the front door at a speed that Margot called dangerous and Julie, catching her, called Tuesday. Nelia came next, more measured, and wrapped both arms around Julie's waist and pressed her face into the side of her coat and stayed there for a while. Nicole stood at the top of the front steps and watched all of it, and when Julie looked up and met her eyes, she lifted one hand in a small, precise wave that meant, "You came back." I noted it. We're fine. The weeks that followed were not smooth. Duilio canceled dinners and then didn't cancel them. He sat on the kitchen floor during baking sessions and was terrible at it, and his daughters were not kind about this, which Julie thought was exactly right. You don't go easy on someone learning something important. He learned Nicole's Wednesday song and got the tempo wrong for 10 consecutive days, and Nicole corrected him each time with the patience of someone who has concluded that the student is not beyond hope. He asked Nelia about the birds and she spent 45 minutes explaining everything she knew, which was considerable, and he sat through all of it. He let Nancy climb him. This was the thing that cost him the most, in the oblique way that the smallest things sometimes carry the most weight. Nancy's method of expressing affection was physical and committed and involved very little regard for the structural integrity of whoever she had selected as her current climbing apparatus. She grabbed his jacket lapel, she stepped on his feet, she grabbed handfuls of his shirt to haul herself upward. The first time she reached for him, really reached, in the open, unguarded way that meant she had decided to try trusting him with this, he felt his hands come up automatically, the old reflex, the brace. He stopped himself. He took a breath. He bent his knees and let her come up. She sat on his shoulders and pointed at her sisters and screamed with satisfaction. He put his hands on her ankles so she wouldn't fall, and he thought about nothing at all, which was new. One evening in December, he was in the kitchen alone after the girls had gone to bed, making himself tea in the particular incompetent way that signaled he had not actually learned to make tea in 40 years on Earth. He looked up at the portraits above the window. The family photographs that lined the wall from the kitchen to the hallway to the staircase, Christmas cards and garden afternoons and a beach somewhere that he now remembered as Portugal, the summer before everything. Kara's photo was there. The one from their 3rd year together, when she was laughing at something behind the camera, her head turned slightly, her expression entirely unguarded. He had always known it was there. He had trained himself, for 9 months, not to look directly at it. He looked at it now. He stood at the counter with his cup of poorly made tea and he looked at his wife's face and he said nothing. He didn't have anything to say that she didn't already know. He thought she probably knew all of it, the 9 months, the empire, the rage in the kitchen doorway, the car parked outside Julie's building, the flower on the ceiling that no one had cleaned and no one was going to clean. He thought she would have found the flower on the ceiling very funny. He turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs. He stopped outside Nancy's room first, door open, the way they all kept their doors, and watched her sleeping for a moment, sprawled at a diagonal that occupied the full width of the bed and then some, pink bow on the pillow beside her because she had started wearing it to sleep. Then Nelia's room, where she had lined up every picture book she owned along the wall beside her bed, organized by color in a system that made complete sense once you understood that Nelia organized everything by color. Then Nicole's doorway, where he paused the longest. Nicole was asleep with her arms at her sides, in the precise, composed way she did everything. But on the pillow beside her, barely visible in the hall light, was a small folded piece of paper. He didn't go in to read it. He would find it in the morning, slipped under his study door, a drawing in crayon, 3 figures with copper hair and one much larger figure in a black jacket, all of them standing in a kitchen. Above the kitchen, along the top of the page, drawn with yellow crayon in the hand of a 4-year-old who had spent 9 months deciding whether the world was worth the risk of being in it. A row of windows. Sunlight coming through. This story reminds us that while you can build an empire with power, you can only build a home with presence. Duilio Genovesi had everything the world says matters, money, influence, and fear, yet he was powerless to reach the 3 little girls who needed him most. It wasn't until he traded his suit for a flour-dusted apron that he truly became a leader where it counted. If this story touched your heart or reminded you that it's never too late to show up for the people you love, please hit the like button. It helps us bring more meaningful stories like this to people who might need to hear them today. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of these emotional journeys. And finally, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the deepest silence can be broken by love. How did Duilio's transformation make you feel? Let us know in the comments below, we read every single one. Thank you for watching, and remember, always turn toward the light.